When we talk about the problems of DEI, we're not talking about the problems of the entire system for ensuring that equal rights are protected. We're talking about a relatively new and yet deeply entrenched ideology that distinguishes between oppressor and oppressed and really puts people into different boxes. There is an organized and shockingly successful effort on many campuses and sectors of society to drive the Jewish community underground, to silence us or force us to speak only to one another and not to the general public.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hi, and welcome to The Contrarian. I'm your host, David Bernstein. Today we speak with Kenneth Marcus, somebody I've known a long time and respected a great deal. And Ken, boy, these must be busy times for you.
We've never been busier, and I'll tell you, there was a time when I first founded the Louis D. Brandeis Center when I was the entire staff. There was a time we had 2 people, when we had 3 people. We are now 13 litigators, but we are far more stretched thin at 13 than I ever was at 1 or 2.
Yeah. So I was going to ask you, how's it been since October 7th for you and the Louis Brandeis Center? But I suppose you started asking that, but what's it been like? What's the flow been?
Well, I hate to say this, but on October 6th, we were actually faced with historic high levels of anti-Semitism to the point where I think that pretty much everyone in my staff needed a vacation after getting the highest caseload that they had ever gotten. Then October 7 hit, and we received within the next 3 weeks an amount of intake that exceeded the prior record-breaking 12 months. And that was even before we worked together with the Anti-Defamation League, Hillel International, and the law firm of Gibson Dunn to form the helpline, which has given us connections with a large number of college students around the country and a lot of additional cases. So what we're seeing is vastly greater volume than ever before, but also a real severity, a real intensity, and also a very significant seepage of the campus anti-Semitism problems into America's high schools, and a vastly greater increase of high school problems than we'd ever seen before.
Yeah, and so you would be launching litigation with high schools as well?
Well, we do what the families need. We never go into a matter saying, we will definitely sue or we will definitely not sue. There are some cases that are appropriate for a lawsuit in a state or federal court or administrative agency. There are others that are more appropriate for other sorts of activities. We go in simply trying to find out what is happening and how we can be helpful. But yes, under the appropriate circumstances, we are bringing lawsuits at both the K-12 and higher ed level. We're also bringing administrative agency actions.
Yeah. Why don't you take a step back for a second and describe the mission of the center?
I founded the Louis D. Brandeis Center a dozen years ago to advance the civil and human rights of the Jewish people and promote justice for all. Our primary work, though, for the entire 12, 13 years of our existence, has been to fight campus anti-Semitism using law and public policy. I had developed during my 2 stints in the U.S. Department of Education, heading its Office for Civil Rights, the policies under which Jewish students are able to gain civil rights protections. And so under those policies that I had developed, we are holding institutions accountable to protect the civil rights of Jewish students to the same extent and with the same seriousness and effectiveness as they do with all of their other students.
Mm-hmm. So for many, December 5th was another seminal day. That was when the university presidents went before Congress, got grilled. What did that change the dynamics for you at all? What was that like for you?
It did. And, I testified 3 times before Congress during the weeks immediately leading up to that. And we worked with congressional staff in the lead up to those hearings. So we were preparing for quite some time for the hearings, and yet they exceeded our expectation in pretty much every respect. To begin with, I never would have anticipated that these university presidents would be quite so ill prepared for the presentations, or that their failures would be quite so blatantly on display, or that they would be so effectively examined by so many members of Congress, not only Elise Stefanik, whose testimony has appropriately gone viral, but many, many members of Congress. And one thing that it tells us is that for those in the Jewish community who feel that we are friendless and who feel that our allies have abandoned us, it was a reminder from many on both parties in the House of Representatives that we do have friends, and friends in high places, and friends who are not going to stop with one hearing. They are continuing to put pressure, and they have been helpful and effective.
I'm going to go deeper in a minute into sort of equal protection and some of the legal issues and some of the tensions that might exist, even in the Jewish and pro-Israel community around free speech versus equal protection and the like. But let's save that for a second and talk a little bit more about the sort of current environment. Among other things that's emerged in the post-October 7th, the post-December 5th order is sort of a groundswell of opposition to diversity, equity, inclusion programs on campuses. What do you make of that?
I think it's healthy, but one thing that's interesting, and this came out during the congressional testimony, not just the one on December 5, but in the prior ones, those people who support DEI don't just have a different position than those people who oppose it. They're talking about something totally different. You could oppose or support increases in the minimum wage, but you will agree with your adversaries what is meant by the term minimum wage. But it became clear that the supporters of DEI weren't really talking about the same thing. They were talking about something that's existed for decades, meaning institutionalized efforts within corporations and public institutions to address discrimination and to provide for diversity of employees or students and to make sure that people feel welcome and respected. But that's not really the DEI that critics are talking about. When we talk about the problems of DEI, we're not talking about the problems of the entire system for ensuring that equal rights are protected. We're talking about a relatively new and yet deeply entrenched ideology that distinguishes between oppressor and oppressed and really puts people into different boxes. I have been saddened by the expansion of DEI and pleased that there is now growing awareness that the very institutions that should be supporting Jewish students and Jewish employees are very frequently making the situation worse for them.
So there's an emerging debate in the Jewish world about what to do about DEI. And I don't know if we're actually on the same side of this. Usually I'm pretty well aligned with you, but I'm curious to see if that's the case here. There's the sort of the engagement school, the engage and influence school. Let's engage DEI programs at universities so that we're able to get them to respect Jewish students and the problem of anti-Semitism. Let's ensconce anti-Semitism in the matrix of oppressions that DEI deals with. That's one school of thought. Another school of thought is, and Barry Weiss has articulated this, let's try to ban DEI. That's sort of simpler and cleaner, and DEI bureaucracies, no matter how we cut it, are going to be a problem. We're not going to get that nicer, gentler form of DEI in universities. A third school, I'm not sure it's a fully developed school, but it's something that, I'm certainly thinking about some, is reforming DEI, not just so it includes Jews, but so that it is liberal in the classical liberal sense, pluralistic, and doesn't impose that oppressor-oppressed binary. Where do you and where does the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights fall on that continuum, or somewhere else, perhaps?
Given the choice of the first versus the second, I would say that Barry Weiss is persuasive to me. The third option that you described, I would need to see articulated a little bit more. But I would also need to say a couple of additional things. While I think that it's been appropriate to dismantle the DEI apparatus in certain states, it's important, nevertheless, to retain anti-discrimination processes, processes to ensure that the disabled receive accommodations, as well as processes to ensure that sexual harassment is properly addressed and eliminated. I would also say that from speaking with university administrators in those states that have dismantled DEI, they haven't always fired anybody. And I'm not saying that I necessarily want to go about firing a lot of different people, but if you ask a university president or dean who was forced to dismantle DEI apparatus and yet didn't terminate anybody, and you ask them, well, what happened to these people? Are they doing completely different work, which is fine, or are they doing similar work but have a different title? Right. So that they no longer call it DEI. They no longer have titles like Chief Diversity Officer, but they're actually up to some of the same problems as before. Sure. So I would say dismantling DEI doesn't necessarily solve the problem unless you're doing it in a really thoughtful and complete way.
Do you see DEI bureaucracies, large DEI bureaucracies, as a major driving force of some of the problems that you're dealing with now with Jewish students and Jewish student rights on campuses?
I certainly see them as a driving force in increased tuition costs for families with children in colleges. So people sometimes use the term DEI broadly to include a whole family of ideologies ranging from not just DEI, but critical race theory, post-colonialism, and anti-racism. To the extent that you glom them all together, yes, I would say that the whole range of these ideologies are a problem. DEI, in a narrow sense, is primarily within the administrations. And I would say that administrations, which should be a part of the solution, are often part of the problem. But faculty are also a significant part of the problem, and they might not be describing their work as DEI. They might be providing post-colonialism or anti-racism or other things of the sort, and they might actually use the term anti-Zionism explicitly. The faculty can be a significant part of the problem too. I think we need to look at administration, we need to look at faculty, and we need to look at student organizations as well as their funders.
When you say we need to look at them, and this is where sort of the rubber meets the road, does that mean we have to say, okay, listen, a given university, it may matter whether it's a public or private university here, but a given university they've done surveys, let's say, has 97%, 98% progressive faculty in the humanities and social sciences. We want to change that, or it has a preponderance of anti-Israel, highly ideological groups. We want to change that. What are the ways that we can go about doing that? What interventions do we have at our disposal?
I think that we need to start with certain things like respect for freedom of speech and make sure that people aren't canceled for saying things that are outside the mainstream of left-wing orthodoxy on college and university campuses. I think we need to consider a diversity of thought and to ensure that people with different perspectives are included. I think we need to provide appropriate security. But beyond that, on those campuses that say that they are committed to diversity, as they all do, but where they have nevertheless seen that their students in large numbers are supporting not just a terrorist organization in Hamas, but they are supporting a terrorist organization in the immediate aftermath of mass slaughter, rape, and torture. When they see that they're doing that, they have to ask themselves, as none of them really are, they have to ask themselves, are these just minor incidents for us to respond to? Or are we very seriously part of the problem, and are we making it worse? And is the problem not just that we have some students who are third parties speaking their mind, but is the problem that we are training a generation of Hamas supporters through our curriculum, through our faculty, and through our leadership. And to that extent, there really needs to be a thoroughgoing reconsideration of every part of the university, from its admissions to its curriculum, to its personnel, its faculty selection and promotion, and the administration.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So I want to ask you, though, I mean, getting sort of into the nitty gritty of this, of the free speech and equal protection discussion, you had these university presidents come before Congress. And, I think many of us agree that if anything, it was an exercise in hypocrisy, right? I mean, these are schools that have neither protected Jews or offered free speech. But it seems to me that they would have had two options for answering it, especially as private universities. One, they could have said, look, we're a university that in theory supports free speech. We haven't done a very good job of that recently. And I can understand why some of you think we're being unfair to talk about free speech now, but we're going to live up to our promise of free speech, to our principles of free speech, and judge us for that in the future. That would have been one answer. Maybe they would have gotten around some of the criticism. Another answer would have been, we're a university that doesn't practice pure free speech. We're a private university. We have very specific anti-harassment policies and discrimination policies in place, and we haven't done a good job of applying those equally to Jewish students. From here on out, we're going to do better. Judge us for that. Do you have a preference? I mean, first of all, do you agree that I'm giving you two answers that might have been more acceptable? And B, do you have a preference for which direction those university presidents should have taken the discussion?
I think the question was really an effort to demonstrate that the emperor is wearing no clothes, right. and it succeeded.
Yes, no doubt.
It succeeded in demonstrating hypocrisy, and that's what
yes.
that's what it is. When we're talking about speech, though, it's not just a question of hypocrisy. That so many of these institutions profess to love the freedom of speech so much that on their campuses they have not one but two First Amendments, the one that we get and the one that the other guys.
Right.
If you look at what's happening on college campuses, we are seeing students who are essentially being told that they cannot put on pro-Israel presentations on campus, or that if they are on campus, that they can't be publicized, or if they are publicized, that it may not be safe for them. It's a lot of them. There is an organized and shockingly successful effort on many campuses and sectors of society to drive the Jewish community underground, to silence us or force us to speak only to one another and not to the general public. And yet at the same time that they are gagging Jewish and especially pro-Israel speech, they're pretending that the Jewish community is the one that's trying to censor others. Insult on top of injury. The biggest free speech problem that we're seeing on campus is not that overzealous supporters of the Jewish students are saying, let's silence the opposition, which occasionally does happen. The biggest problem that we're seeing is that enemies of the Jewish community are trying to silence the Jews. That's something that we see a lot.
Mm-hmm. So there's this debate that has been brewing in circles that probably the both of us are part of, right? That we both, in the waters that we swim in, both in the Jewish community and perhaps the free speech libertarian community. And it's interesting, I've been interviewing really top thinkers, people you're probably familiar with, my namesake, David E. Bernstein, Randy Barnett, Eugene Volokh, Nadine Strawson, and the like. These are very thoughtful people about this. And the question I keep on posing to them is this, that, it seems like there's some tension, at least, between free speech, whether you talk about it explicitly only in a legal sense or also in terms of a culture of free speech, and equal protection. In other words, you could argue that, okay, these universities haven't practiced free speech. They're not going to practice free speech. They have all these microaggression policies in place in which they use to stifle free speech. So under such conditions, they have to apply the law and their own regulations and rules equally, or else they're in violation of the equal protection of Jewish students. There's another school of thought, and I think Eugene Volokh summarized it very well. He says, I don't want equal protection of repression. In other words, he's not willing to live with that option of universities stifling free speech of anybody, and he's going to really stick to his guns with freedom of expression with free speech. Where do you fall on that? How do you actually characterize that tension, if you even see it as a tension?
First, whenever we see extreme anti-Jewish speech on campuses, we almost always see anti-Jewish conduct as well. Usually conduct of a sort that everyone would agree is conduct. I mean, it just is usually the case that people might come to us because they've heard bad things, insulting, offensive things said about Jews, and they've heard it and they can quote it, and it's been quoted in the blogosphere or the media. But if you really ask them, okay, what's going on there? The real problem with this hate speech is that it really does lead to hate conduct and hate crimes. You find that there are the conduct and incidents as well, and then you can focus on the conduct and the incidents. But beyond that, I don't think that public institutions should be choosing between free speech and equal protection. That's not an option given to them by the Constitution, and they shouldn't put themselves above the Constitution. They really need to provide both. There may be times where hostile environments have been created out of speech in the anti-Semitic context, just as there are certainly in the sexual harassment context. But in those situations, if you cannot find other instances as well, if it turns out that you are dealing only with constitutionally protected expression, the institution nevertheless has an obligation to address the situation in what's called a non-regulatory way. That is to say, to develop training, orientation, processes, procedures, support services for targeted groups. There are a whole wide array of options available for institutions to take actions even when offensive activity takes the form of purely protected activity. Again, most of the time where there's offensive speech, there's also offensive conduct, and they should deal with conduct. But if there isn't offensive conduct, if it's just speech, there are things that can be done by the institution that would be entirely consistent with the First Amendment, even as interpreted by Eugene Volokh.
What would you want the university to do in those situations?
My former agency, the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, or OCR, provided guidance in 2010 that made the point. First, they confirmed my prior policy that Jews are protected under Title VI. That's something that I had established almost exactly 20 years ago.
Thank you, by the way. Really.
I appreciate that. So in 2010, the Obama administration ratified that, but also gave it some detail. And they made the point that even if an institution is taking disciplinary action against a perpetrator, that may not be enough, because if the environment has been made toxic by activities that can harm more than just the targeted individual, punishment is enough. Other things have to be done, and OCR listed a whole number of different things that can be done in terms of making clear its values, its policies, its procedures, investigating the situation, monitoring it, so on and so forth. There is no shortage of things that can be done by the institution, whether they are using their disciplinary procedures or not.
Mm-hmm. So let me put out a case study for a second. I mean, it's not a real study, but I'm sure it exists in reality in some way, shape, or form. A board of trustees member or members at a given, let's say, public university, for the sake of argument, proposed that the university president and administration make it very clear that chants such as globalizing the Intifada or from the river to the sea violate the university's anti-discrimination and harassment regulations. And so therefore, any students who engage in that kind of conduct or, engage in a march using those slogans are engaging in a kind of, discriminatory behavior that's not going to be acceptable by the university. Do you think that, how would you look at that?
So I don't know. So first of all, I think that the institution should be acting consistently among different groups Traditionally, they have been very concerned about speech that is oppressive of other groups, but have ignored it towards Jews. That's bad. I think there should be even-handedness and consistency. With respect to a particular chant, whether it's constitutionally permissible to regulate it or not, that could be for the courts to say. But my point to you is twofold. First, on that campus where there are people chanting from the rivers to the sea, they're also spitting on Jewish students. They're also pushing and shoving Jewish students. They're vandalizing Jewish students. They shouldn't pretend as if the only thing that's going on is the chant, and they need to address the other. And then the other thing is whether a particular chant can permissibly be restricted or penalized or not. If there are people on campus who are calling for the genocide of the Jewish people, the issue is bigger than whether you punish them or not. This institution needs to figure out how this is happening. Almost certainly the institution has poured immense resources into DEI for the purpose of ensuring that its students are feeling included. And yet whatever they've done has resulted in a situation in which there are calls for the genocide of groups that include members of their student body. So what they're doing is altogether wrong. And whether they penalize a group of students or not, they really need to ask about their own complicity. What are they doing through their admissions? What are they doing through their orientation? What are they doing through their training, through their curriculum that actually creates this situation in which students think that it's appropriate to do this?
So we've seen at some campuses, some universities, where the university has failed to sort of prosecute students for their conduct. Like at MIT, I believe, there was a very explicit refusal to go after foreign students who were involved because they might get deported. Have you seen that in a lot of places? Is that a trend, or are we just seeing that in a few places?
We've heard about it, but I think I've heard about the MIT incident over and over again. I don't know how widespread it is, but we should be concerned about it. This is a situation in which the MIT administration appears to be acknowledging that they are discriminating against U.S. citizens and lawful residents of various sorts. That if a U.S. citizen is engaged in certain forms of harassment, the U.S. citizen will be punished. But if someone is a non-citizen who could potentially be excluded under visa status, they get a preferred treatment. This should be outrageous to anyone who is or cares about a U.S. citizen.
Absolutely. Yes, it's confounding in a way that anybody would actually say that out loud. That's the quiet part out loud, I think, if I've ever heard it. But I'm sure it's more prevalent than just the MIT situation.
Well, David, I think that this is an example of university administrators working within echo chambers in which they're saying things that they know will make sense to the people around them and that they reasonably expect will be agreeable to the people around them. And it just hasn't occurred to them that what they're saying will be appalling to large numbers of the American population. And
right.
It didn't occur to them until after the congressional hearing.
Right. I think the congressional hearing really brought that to light. You're seeing sort of this incredible clash of cultures, this sort of university bubble, which talks to itself about all these issues and has a totally different operating code. And then sort of the rest of the population. By the way, I don't think it's really just a partisan issue. I think the average normie American cannot understand why you'd have all these microaggressions that you're applying to all manner of student life, and then saying it's okay to talk about genocide, or it's okay to chant genocide. But that's some of what we're seeing. And I imagine had these university presidents said something a bit more authentic, a bit more true, they would have actually faced the music back in their own campuses.
I think that's right. I think that it is a sign of the immense divide between certain cultural elites, especially at university campuses, versus the public at large. And I agree that it is not just a partisan issue.
I know that you're involved in the legal front, but you're also clearly looking at the larger picture, what do we do about universities that are producing the legal problems that were created to push back against? It seems to me that there's several things on the table now. I mean, a lot of people are talking about getting rid of DEI. We've already sort of addressed that. Another potential solution that I've heard a lot about in having these various conversations are creations of departments or centers for civic thought. And we're seeing them in several universities. Yale Law School recently announced the opening of one. University of North Carolina has one. And I think that they're starting to spread. Maybe they're spreading more readily in red state universities than blue states, but I think they're happening in both. What do you think of that trend? Do you think that offers some hope here?
So there are different sorts of academic centers that can provide some sort of oasis of rationality, whether they're called centers of civic thought, of Western civilization, or other things. Robbie George at Princeton has a center that is a kind of an opposition to the culture elsewhere in his university. Similarly, there are centers at University of Florida and elsewhere. I think that this is one potential approach. The value of it is that you don't have to give up on the major institutions. You can work within a university that exists. The downside is the question of whether they really will have durability and whether they're subject to capture by the institution.
Yeah.
To make them really safe, I suppose you would need to do certain things like ensuring that they have complete control over faculty selection. There are lots of things that have to be done to insulate them, and without that, they won't necessarily continue to have vitality past the tenure of their founding chairs. Then there are other approaches, of course, as well, like creating entirely new institutions, like the University of Austin, which is a much more ambitious undertaking. Probably it is less vulnerable to some of the challenges of university-based centers, but requires vastly more in the way of resources.
Right, and time perhaps to get established. And so. What else can we do? There's a debate, I think a much needed debate, even within people who generally agree that universities are a problem and we need to deal with the rot. There's the sort of Chris Rufo school, which says, look, what got us here was a power play by a bunch of very bad actors over a long period of time. And now, if we're going to reverse this, we're going to have to engage in power politics ourselves. A scalpel of discourse and op-eds is not enough to do the trick. We're going to actually have to take a sledgehammer and really go after universities and use every political tool in our toolbox. There's a reaction to that, of course, by a lot of sort of liberal academics who, even, by the way, some libertarian academics who I've spoken to, who are generally center-right on a lot of issues, who are worried that this is just going to create another form of illiberalism on campus. Where do you think? What's your take on that?
Well, I certainly don't think that incremental reforms have gotten us anywhere or are likely to. I don't think that it's necessarily wrong to look very carefully at what the more extreme reformers are doing to make sure they don't create the opposite problem. But I am of the view that we've gotten to a situation on many college campuses that is beyond incremental change, and we really need to think bigger.
Mm-hmm. I know we talked some about DEI. Have you or the center actually ever sued a university over, let's say, DEI statements, or is that outside the ambit of the the center's mission? Like, I know there's some talk that, look, it's not just about what's above the waterline, if you think of the iceberg metaphor, what's above the waterline in the anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, but we're going to have to start using our legal tools to oppose the underlying ideological ferment there. And that includes things like DEI statements or some discriminatory forms of DEI. Have you thought about getting into that area as well?
Well, Well, in terms of prioritizing our cases, we look at cases in which the specific application of policies is harming Jewish students or faculty. So we have taken aim at DEI structures in which Jewish students or professors are facing harassment and discrimination, which is directly traceable to DEI approaches. But we haven't yet more broadly attack DEI per se. The fact is that we have so many cases right now in which students and faculty have really directly been harmed by actual activity on the campus. So that's where we're focusing.
Mm-hmm. So I might be wrong about this, but if so, please correct me. I know my understanding was that you all were actually very involved in the engagement of DEI on campuses and trying to get them to include anti-Semitism in the mix. Is that wrong, or was that the case at some point?
No, we get what changes we can get to move in the right direction. Mm-hmm. So where there are programs that have oppressed or oppressed ideologies that harm Jewish students, we have tried to dismantle those where we can. Where what we have evidence of is simply that Jews are excluded from DEI, we do try to get Jews included. We don't see that as being a solution to the broad problem, but sometimes that is the remedy that we can tie to the violation for which we have evidence in a particular case.
Right. Yeah, it seems there's an interesting tension there. I mean, I appreciate the distinction you made, by the way, when you've seen a very highly ideological DEI program and you really realize you're not going to be able to change it. The people involved, the ideologies at play are just going to continue to reinforce the anti-Semitism and the illiberalism. I make a distinction between DEI that's just a little crazy and batshit crazy. And, the oppressor-oppressed batshit crazy stuff, sometimes it's even in the form of white supremacy culture framework, which is this idea that all Western and American culture is white supremacy culture, like being to work or school on time is white supremacy culture. That to me crosses a line, and engaging that and just trying to get Jews included is an exercise in futility, and maybe worse in a way. Maybe it's just reinforcing the ideological framework. And I'm wondering if that's a debate you're having within your own ranks about whether or not even engaging maybe the slightly less crazy versions of it or might also be in reinforcing the overall enterprise.
No, I mean, I think that on the one hand, we see that the entire structure has some real problems. On the other hand, we see in individual cases what we can accomplish may, for practical matters, be different. And we don't always see that adding Jewish identity or anti-Semitism is going to reinforce the structure. It might be that it will get us less in terms of long-term change than what we want to see. But I don't think that adding a module in which people learn about anti-Semitism, for instance, is going to reinforce a system in which they learn about other forms of hate or bias.
So we've been talking about how this oppressor narrative is reinforcing and really fueling anti-Semitism on campus and other institutions. I've certainly founded an organization, Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, whose purpose is to raise awareness of that. Yet I've gotten a lot of flack for that, particularly before October 7th and particularly in the days, let's say, after George Floyd, but it's waned some. I'm wondering how, here you are talking to me in a public venue about it. Is that something that you're doing more of? Are you sensing a change in our own community, the Jewish community, about sort of talking about the larger ideological trends?
I mean, as recently as 2023, I was asked more than once not to talk about DEI, or if I have to talk about it, to go light. By hosts that had invited me to speak about anti-Semitism. I don't know that they would do that as much right now in 2024. I think that there is a greater awareness of the problem. Also, when I have addressed the dangers of DEI in either testimony or speaking engagements, I've tended to get positive feedback and not negative feedback from it. So there is a perceptible change between 2023 and 2024. Whether we passed the high watermark or not, I don't know. I would say that DEI is very much deeply entrenched in most major economic and social and cultural and educational institutions in this country, but criticizing it is no longer as dangerous as it was not long ago.
Mm-hmm. So I want to ask you sort of to end the conversation, I'm sure you're working on a lot of cases, as you said. Any really stick out to you that might actually help be defining moments moving forward?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we have several. So I would say that our federal lawsuit against the University of California at Berkeley over the really widespread, outrageous, harassing conduct, as well as the anti-Zionist bylaws and constitutions. I would say that our state court lawsuit against the Santa Ana Public Schools in Southern California, where we're working together with ADL, Stand With Us, and the American Jewish Committee, that's challenging a form of ethnic studies that we believe to be anti-Semitic, and which is being pushed on that community in a sort of non-transparent way. Mm-hmm. I would say those are two of the big ones. We have a couple in the pike that I'm not quite yet able to speak about, but that are coming in upcoming weeks or so in different parts of the country. So yes, there are several of them that really embody some of the worst that we've seen in anti-Semitism recently, and are going to be pushing for change.
Yeah, there was one case that you were working on, and I don't know where it stands now, but if you can talk about it, I'd love you to. There were two people from the sort of counseling services at Stanford, I think Ron Albucher and Sarah Levin, if I'm not mistaken, who were, Ron is a psychiatrist, Sarah a social worker, who were involved in sort of a very discriminatory DEI situation. They weren't allowed to define their own affinity groups. They were shut down when they raised the issue of anti-Semitism. And I think it was you who brought, legal action against them. Where does that stand?
We did bring that as a EEOC action. I can't speak to the details of that matter, but it is a good example of the sort of thing that we do challenging DEI. There's also a case at Brooklyn College involving students in a graduate health program who faced discrimination coming out of a DEI ideology as well. So we have multiple cases dealing with that. I can't always discuss the status and details of pending cases, but I can tell you that we brought them before and will continue to bring them.
Ken, I can't express enough appreciation for the work that you do, and how you do it. So thank you so much for that, and I really look forward to continuing the conversation.
Always a pleasure, David. Really appreciate being on your program, and look forward to continuing the conversation as well.
Thank you for tuning in to The Contrarian. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to rate our podcast on Apple and Spotify. Stay connected with us on social media for more updates. Until next time, keep challenging.